Thanks, Tony. When I think of great endeavors, I also think about the individuals, the amazing individuals that help get us there. And for me, the person that comes to mind is Dr. Shawna Pandya. And the reason why is Shawna is a medical doctor, but not just that. She's a martial artist. She's an aquanaut. She's a skydiver. She's done so many amazing things. She's also an Explorers Club member, and I believe you are too, Jeff.
Very well done. That is true. Yes, I've been a proud and enthusiastic member of the Explorers Club for many years. And in fact, it was at the Explorers Club headquarters in New York where we arranged for the very first screening of First to the Moon, Paul Hildebrandt's beautiful film about Apollo 8. And so, yes, it's been really a very rewarding part of my career to be associated with the EC, as we like to call it. And in fact, I hope or think I was one of the first people to congratulate Shawna when she was approved for not just a member, but a fellow, actually. And so I've been a fan of hers and her work for many years, but I never actually met her in person until last year. And we had attended many of the same space conferences, follow her on Twitter, enjoy watching her amazing exploits around the world. And so last year at the Space Development Conference, I just said, enough's enough. So I sent her an official invitation for tea. Would you have time for tea with the president of the National Space Society? And she said, I'd be delighted.
I love that.
So we met for tea at the Space Development Conference, like two adults, and she is gracious and fascinating. And I was thrilled to discover that her home city is Edmonton in Canada, which is my favorite city in Canada. So I said, "Oh, you live in my favorite city?" And she goes, "It is?" And I said, "Yes, I have a great affection for Edmonton. We were based there a couple of times, and we were filming Meteorite Men episodes."
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I love everything about Canada because I am an ice hockey player.
I didn't know that about you.
Yes.
Ice hockey as well in your
Yes.
spare time. This would be brilliant for ice hockey. You put a little ice ring in there. What do you think? Ice
I
hockey
think
in
it would,
the-
absolutely.
Yeah?
I
All right.
think we need to have ice hockey on the moon.
Extraterrestrial sports. We've just developed a whole new subgenre.
But the thing about it is that with sports comes injuries, and we really have to think about how, as an astronaut, do we stay safe and healthy? And that's what I love about Shawna is that she's also a medical doctor on top of everything else. And so you have the explorer and the medical doctor, and what she does is that she learns from all of her amazing experiences and then thinks about how that is applied to living in space. And I actually am part of Project Possum with Shawna, and it's all about spaceflight training beyond living in Moon and Mars simulations. So analog astronauts do this, but they also want to get themselves flight ready. And so that is all about pressure chambers and being aquanauts and skydiving and all of these things. But it's also about top physical shape, mentally, emotionally, all of those things being stable. And that's what Dr. Shawna Pandya does. And so she's going to talk to us about medicine on the moon, Mars, and beyond. Take it away, Shawna.
What does the future of space medicine hold? Hi, my name is Dr. Shawna Pandya, and I'm a physician in general practice and ER up in Canada. I'm also the director of the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences and Project Possum, and I'm also the lead instructor for operational space medicine within these two organizations as scientist astronaut candidate with both of these organizations, as well as an aquanaut and a NSS member for the past 5 years. I've also been the track chair for the International Space Development Conference's Launchpad track for during these past 5 years. I have previously conducted research at NASA's Johnson Space Center in aerospace medicine, as well as the European Astronaut Center's Crew Medical Support Office. So I think it's safe to say that during this time I've learned a little bit about medicine, and specifically space medicine. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's start by defining the spaceflight environment. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to conduct a thought experiment. What would happen if you got your hands on a jetpack and were feeling really adventurous one day, and then you decided to go as high as you possibly could just to see what would happen? Well, if the lack of oxygen in the thinning atmosphere didn't kill you first and you made it all the way to space without a helmet, contrary to what you see in Hollywood movies, your head won't explode in a vacuum, but you would die pretty quickly. Nor would you freeze to death right away. The one saving grace of being exposed to the vacuum of space is that there's no convection to steal away all your bodily heat right away. That being said, the vacuum creates a great pressure differential between your body and the vacuum of space, where there is no pressure at all. So suffice to say, the fluids from your body, including your eyeballs and your tongue, would boil off right away, leaving those to freeze. And then any pliable tissues that could hold air, like your lungs, if you tried to hold your breath to survive, would rupture. And so I think it's safe to say that we can all agree to stay safe in space, you need some element of protection, either through a spacesuit or a spacecraft. So say now that you were lucky enough to have a spacecraft. Say you're on the International Space Station. What is the environment like up there? The immediate answer that comes to mind is zero gravity. You get to float around. You're also exposed to increased radiation, altered day-night cycles. At 450 kilometers above the Earth in low Earth orbit, you're exposed to up to 16 sunrises and sunsets over 24 hours. That's a sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes. Not to mention the psychological stress of being in an isolated and confined environment away from loved ones, living in a high-stress, operational, confined space with loud noises. So it may not be the most easy to live in environment. On top of that, you have to trust that the environment itself will behave. You have to trust that the sun won't act up with a solar particle event or solar flare, exposing you to increased amounts of ionizing radiation. You have to trust that your spacecraft won't be penetrated by passing space debris. And finally, you have to trust in the engineering of your enclosed loop life support system to both keep your temperature within a habitable zone, as well as maintain the atmospheric concentration of oxygen and scrub the atmosphere of any volatile compounds from off-gassing that may have occurred, as well as carbon dioxide. So there's a lot of considerations when it comes to keeping humans healthy in space. That's beside the everyday lumps, bumps, medical issues, pathology, and trauma that can occur while up there. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about microgravity. From the moment that we're take off on launch, we're exposed to an altered G-load. This starts with an increased G-load or acceleration force and increased amounts of loading on our bones and increased amounts of vibration. As soon as we get into orbit, we're lucky enough to feel weightless and float for the first time. But that comes with a price on our own physiology. In the first 24 to 72 hours, we might experience what is called space adaptation syndrome or space motion sickness. So I want to challenge you to try an experiment right now. Close your eyes and stick out your hand somewhere in front of your face, just like this. Do you know where your hand is? You do. How is that? Even if you can't see it, you have these special nerve endings called proprioceptors that tell you exactly where your body is in space. So we may take it for granted of how we balance and how we see, but balance is actually a finely tuned coordination between our eyes, which tell us what we're seeing, our inner ears, which control our balance, as well as our proprioceptors. Every 7 billion of us humans here on Earth have had the luxury of growing up in 1G. So it's easy to take our inner ears for granted. When we get to zero gravity, these systems are thrown completely off, and that can make us really nauseous, really sick, and for up to 72 hours upon being in a microgravity environment, we can get violently ill. This almost always passes, and this is why critical events like spacewalks, are not scheduled in that first 72 hours. But that's just the start of it. There is not a single bodily system that is not affected by being in zero gravity, or more formally, microgravity. Whether we're talking about our bones, our muscles, our immune system, our central nervous systems, our kidneys, every single one of these systems is affected. Our muscles lose mass. Again, it's easy to take gravity for granted. But if I stick out my hand in front of me, if I don't resist, my hand drops because of gravity. So even though we don't think about it, our bones and our muscles at any given time on Earth are loaded by gravity. When we go to the zero-G environment, there's no resistive force, and so our muscles and our bones, without having this resistance, tend to atrophy if you're a muscle, or lose bone density if you're a bone, particularly in weight-bearing areas like our spine, our pelvis, and our thigh bones. The other thing that's easy to take for granted is where our fluids go. On Earth, gravity pulls everything down to our feet. That's not the case on the International Space Station. In the absence of gravity, all those fluids shift upwards. The consequence of that being that our bodies interpret us as holding on to more fluid, so we pee that out. So we may be a little bit dehydrated in the first few days of being in space. That actually, the loss of plasma volume tends to lead to something called spaceflight anemia, or decreased red blood cell mass. And this fluid shift can make us more prone to kidney stone. And it doesn't end there. What we know from studies in microgravity is that our central nervous system is suspect to something that we call space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. We're still trying to figure out exactly what the mechanism is, but decades of spaceflight have taught us that astronauts, particularly men, are experiencing changes in vision, headaches, flattening of their eyeballs, as well as increased pressure on their optic nerves. That's the nerve that connects the back of your eye to your brain. So, suffice to say, there's a lot going on when it comes to being in space, particularly being in microgravity. The list is endless. We know that our immune systems are suppressed in microgravity. We know that bugs and germs are more virulent. So, what else is there to worry about? We also know that there's gender differences, that certain afflictions in space affect men more preferentially, and certain afflictions affect women more preferentially. So, for example, for men, they are more prone to exactly what we just discussed with visual changes related to the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. Women, on the other hand, are more prone to UTIs, or urinary tract infections, and when they get back to Earth, are also more prone to orthostatic hypotension, which is a fancy way of saying fainting. So after all that time in space, the valves in your veins in your feet got this physiological message that they can take a vacation and then don't do their job when it comes to being back on Earth, and don't let the blood in your veins flow in one way. And so that makes us more prone to fainting, because we don't have a way to easily continue letting that blood circulate back centrally. Let's talk a little bit about radiation now. So, when we're on the surface of the Earth, we're exposed to a certain amount of background radiation. We're still relatively protected by the atmosphere, but the higher we go and the less atmosphere there is to filter out harmful UV rays, the more at risk we are. Even flying on a commercial jet, you are exposed to more radiation. At the level of the International Space Station, in a given day, you're exposed to 250 times more radiation than you would be at the surface of the Earth. But you're still within the confines of Earth's magnetosphere and the Van Allen belt, which help protect out even more harmful forms of ionizing radiation, like solar particle events, or solar flares, and galactic cosmic radiation. And the science doesn't end there. At every single turn, we're learning more about how the human body reacts in space, in microgravity, in a high stress, high radiation environment. With the famous NASA twin study, whereupon they studied now retired astronauts Mark Kelly and Scott Kelly, as Commander Kelly spent 1 year on space while his twin brother spent 1 year on Earth. And what we found is that everything from our DNA and the length of the telomeres, which are thought to be related to aging, were changed while from being in spaceflight for a year while being on Earth. As early as last year, we found out that physiology is still surprising us. On a routine ultrasound study to image the jugular veins in our neck, one astronaut was found to have a giant blood clot in their veins and required anticoagulation or a way of preventing the clot from getting bigger. What am I trying to say with all this? If you take nothing away from everything I've just told you, it's simply space is trying to kill you. And this is just low Earth orbit. On the International Space Station, if something catastrophic were to happen, we would still have the luxury of evacuating to Kazakhstan in as little as 3.5 hours. It may not be a comfortable ride if we have something like a broken bone and still have to experience re-entry and a hard impact on landing, in a Soyuz, for example, but at least you're not far from home. So, how do we go about keeping humans healthy in space? And what are the principles that guide us? Well, very briefly, risk, prevention, and design. I want you to keep those three concepts in mind because even whether we're staying close to home at the low Earth orbit, going to the moon, or to Mars and beyond, these are the principles that guide how we keep humans healthy in space and space medicine in general. When we talk about risk, and you're going to see a theme here, we deconstruct risk into severity as well as likelihood. So when we talk about risk, we don't say, this looks risky. We talk about how likely is something to happen versus how bad is it if it does. So say something's fairly unlikely, but really severe if it happens. Having a baby in space, really unlikely. We don't need to mitigate that. What about something that's very likely, but not really severe? Say a paper cut or an abrasion. We should plan to treat it so it doesn't get infected, but again, it's not catastrophic. By catastrophic, we mean it's not mission ending or it's not threat to life. What about a worst case scenario? Say something is high risk as well as catastrophic if it happens. So decompression sickness. By decompression sickness, we mean that when we are exposed to a different pressure differential, a lower pressure differential, wherein the gases that are dissolved in our bodily fluids in our blood can come out of solution and then lodge as bubbles in places that would be really bad, like joints or even our brains, causing a seizure, stroke, or even death, that needs to be mitigated. It's why we have pre-breathing countermeasures right before we go on a spacewalk to prevent exactly that sort of thing from happening. So risk identification and mitigation is key. Prevention is another cornerstone of keeping humans healthy in space. This starts at astronaut selection, both in terms of physiology as well as psychology. When we're selecting astronauts, we have select in as well as select out criteria. So some examples might be blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, say 140/90 or higher, then you're automatically selected out because it's one less thing we have to worry about when we're up in space. Similarly, psychologically, when we talk about select in criteria, we want candidates who will make the mission most likely to be successful, will work as a team, and will be very objective focused. Other examples of countermeasures continue throughout selection with pre-flight quarantine, particularly relevant during a pandemic, as well as looking at pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight rehab and countermeasures, including examples of exercise that astronauts have to perform daily while they're on the International Space Station with aerobic exercise, resistive activity, and powered weights, as well as things like nutrition, monitoring, continuous studying, and looking at more measures that we can identify for future flight, as we discussed about in this twin study a couple of minutes ago. So the list goes on and on, but the bottom line is that if you can stop something from happening before you ever have to treat it in space, well then it's exactly as they say, an ounce of cure is worth a pound of prevention. Speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about design. So let's take a closer look at exactly what the healthcare system on the International Space Station looks like, because it's going to be important in the second half of this talk when we talk about going to the moon, Mars, and beyond. So the International Space Station houses the CHECS system, which is an acronym like everything else in space, and stands for the Crew Healthcare System. So when we talk about the CHECS system, we talk about three key components. That's the environmental health system, the countermeasure system, as well as the health maintenance system. So we've kind of alluded to all of these already. The environmental maintenance system is everything that just keeps the environment habitable, from temperature to moisture to atmospheric control. It's our life support system. The countermeasure system we alluded to when we talked about exercise. So to keep our bones and our muscles as happy as possible without having the luxury of 1G, we have to exercise. So we have to perform 2 hours of aerobic activity, resistive exercise every single day. Of course, health issues, medical issues will happen on the ISS. And so that's where the health maintenance system comes in. That includes everything from the worst case scenario, including a defibrillator, as well as crew restraint system to restrain a fellow astronaut and be able to perform CPR if necessary, to basic life support kits, advanced life support kits, medical kits, and more. So how exactly do we know what to prevent and how to design for space? Well, we talked a little bit about how important it is to know about probabilities when we talked about risk. And that actually informs a lot of how operational space medicine is performed. NASA operates in terms of probabilities as well as the likelihood of a particular medical incident happening. So, for example, when we try to pack for space, we look at what is most likely to happen and what will be most threatening to the crew if it's not mitigated. So that's where NASA, for example, has created its exploration medical capabilities top 100 list of medical conditions that should be prepared to be addressed on any human spaceflight expedition. This can include any of the scary stuff from asystole and needing to perform CPR, so if someone loses their pulse, to a severe trauma, to something less severe but equally scary like diarrhea in space. Another tool that NASA has that relies on probabilities and numbers is called the Integrated Medical Model, which takes into account the likelihood and incidence of a medical issue occurring, the crew composition and mission profile, as well as the probability of an issue occurring and the threat to the mission, such as the probability of evacuation, as well as the threat to life or loss of crew if it occurs, and then calculates, based on previous data, what exactly you would need in terms of medical kit contents and quantities to help effectively deal with those medical pathologies and situations, and in so doing, hopefully decrease the loss of life or the risk of loss of life and the risk of loss of crew. So to summarize, we've said several key things so far. First of all, space is trying to kill you. Second of all, it takes a lot to keep humans happy and healthy, and not just surviving, but thriving in space. The other thing that I hope has become apparent by this point is that space is hard. Access to space is hard, and it's costly. This brings us into the importance of design. And when we talk about designing for space, I like to think of it as the Aladdin principle. Infinite cosmic power to get there, itty bitty living space. How does that translate into designing for space and space medicine in particular? It means that anything that we bring with us needs to be low cost, low mass, low volume, low power, easy to use, and resistant to the elements of the environment. For example, looking at previous kits that have been on the International Space Station, any medication that we need to bring with us need to have a long shelf life. And ideally, if we're talking about antibiotics, for example, the same antibiotic could be used for, say, a skin infection as well as a urinary tract infection. Whereas, taking a ridiculous example, it makes less sense to bring something like surgical forceps that would be used in case of a difficult delivery, because you just don't expect it to happen, and the likelihood is very low of that happening on the International Space Station. So everything we've talked about so far is limited to that little space around Earth called low Earth orbit. But if you've been paying attention to space news lately, we don't intend on sticking around here forever. We have plans to go to the Moon, Mars, and beyond. Over the next few years with Lunar Gateway, as early as 2022, we expect assembly to start, and by 2026, seeing operations with 4 astronauts aboard the Lunar Gateway to perform science, astronomy, lunar observation, solar observation, and Earth observation. Beyond that, as well as going to lunar orbit, NASA and the international community have plans to return to the moon with the Artemis missions. As early as 2024, the next woman and the first woman and the next American man could lay boots on the lunar surface. In tandem, the European Space Agency has announced plans for a moon village. The Canadian Space Agency has very straightforwardly come out and said they would like to take the lead in operational space medicine for the Moon, Mars, and beyond. So I think it's pretty apparent that we have plans and ambitions to literally shoot for the stars as well as land on the moon. All of this is really neat. And the idea of going to the moon and establishing permanent surface operations on the moon is not just science, is not just exploration, but also to establish the moon as a test bed for when we finally make it to Mars as early as the mid-2030s. It's not just the governmental agencies that have proposed to go this far, it's the commercial sector as well. As early as 2016, both SpaceX and Boeing proposed to be the first commercial entity on Mars. But coming back to a running theme, space is dangerous, space is hostile, and space is trying to kill you. So we have a few problems to solve. We talked a little bit earlier about space radiation and the challenges it poses. At least on the International Space Station, within the confines of the Van Allen belts, we have that protection from stronger forms of ionizing and radiation, such as solar particle events, as well as galactic cosmic radiation. Once we go beyond the Van Allen belts, even as close as the moon, we lose that protection. And so if we're seriously thinking of going to the moon and beyond, we also need to be thinking about radiation and radiation protection going forward. In fact, the further we go, the more issues crop up. Everything we talked about earlier this talk with respect to radiation, confinement, being away from our loved ones, altered day-night cycles, the need to rely on our enclosed roof life support systems, as well as the threat of microgravity, all of that still applies. But wait, there's more. And the further out we go, not only is radiation an issue, but NASA has a whole human research roadmap of even more stuff that can happen to us in long duration or exploration class missions. This includes everything from crew dynamics to performance, to interfacing with robots and computers, to the risk of radiation, to psychology, to simply losing our skills on a long-duration mission. Taken with that, the further away from Earth we go, the longer of a communication delay we will experience. On the moon, not so bad. It's about a 3-second one-way time delay, 6 seconds total. Annoying, but bearable. To get to Mars, with current technologies, it's a 6 to 9 month one-way trip. Depending on the alignment of the moon and Mars, it is approximately a 6 to 9 month journey, and it is about a 4 to 23 minute one-way time lag. That means at the furthest opposition, the moon and Mars, to have a conversation would be a 48-minute round-way conversation. So not ideally convenient. What does that mean for medicine, for example? It means that we have to bring our procedures with us, we have to bring our training with us, and we can't necessarily rely on help from Earth through telemedicine or teleconsultants if we're truly planning on going to Mars, and we certainly cannot rely on instant evacuation from Mars. Remember, at the space station, we talked about a 3.5-hour evacuation to Kazakhstan if the need arises. On the moon, that expands to 3 to 5 days. If you're actively dying, not ideal. By the time you get to Mars, 6 to 9 months out, there's no talk or thought of evacuation being a viable option. So, here's my question to you. You're the crew doctor, you're packing for Mars. What do you pack, and how do you do it? So, we've talked about the challenges of keeping humans healthy, and also how we might keep them healthy, as well as our constraints when it comes to design, mass, space, cost. But let's look at the other end of the spectrum. I would ask you to imagine, what is the gold standard? What is the ideal scenario for healthcare if there were zero constraints? Say you made it to Mars. Well, the answer would be to just have another Earth with you. If you had another Earth, you wouldn't have to worry about decreased gravity, increased radiation, closed loop life support systems, having renewable resources. Essentially, if you bring your own Earth with you, all of those problems become mitigated. Of course, terraformation isn't an option yet, but it does beg the question, what if we not just provided the standard of care of health that we would accept on Earth, which is exactly what we should be aspiring towards, but what if we leverage technology to surpass that and create a new, better standard of care? And to that, I say we should look towards science fiction. So, what if we were able to mitigate the bone density and muscle atrophy problem by borrowing on rotating space station concepts from movies like Space Odyssey 2001 or The Martian to create 1/3 gravity on the way to Mars to prevent that decompensation? What if we borrowed on concepts from Star Wars, for example, to create exoskeletons on Mars? So even if we were decompensated, we would still have enough power and performance to build, to operate, to perform science, to explore on Mars. What if we had technologies like the Matrix and the holodeck from Star Wars to immediately upload skills to our brains so we didn't have to worry about de-skilling on the way to Mars? Or what if we just decided that going to a place like Mars, for all the reasons we've talked about today, is just too dangerous and sent either a holograph or an avatar? Well, these ideas aren't so far-fetched. One of my favorite papers of all time comes from the MIT Review in 2017, where the authors talk about exactly that. borrowing ideas from science fiction to help keep astronauts healthy. It's called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And they talk about research that's being done today, such as splicing genes from elephants into human DNA to be able to prevent them from getting cancer. The thoughts being that elephants never get cancer, and the reason is that they have 4 copies rather than 2 copies of their oncogenes, or the cancer editing cells. It sounds kind of science fiction, and it's really early stage now. I think they're still just experimenting with bananas. But it kind of brings to mind this idea of Gattaca, or engineering DNA, but for good. And we can talk about the ethics of genetically engineering humans, but the other question that we have to ask is, if we know we're sending astronauts into a highly dangerous, hostile environment that's likely to kill them, is it perhaps more unethical to not genetically augment them or enhance them and send them unprepared into that environment? Just some food for thought. The point I want to make is there are a lot of challenges going forward as we look to the moon and beyond as destinations. And to get there, we are going to have to science the space out of this. Or to be more exact, we're going to have to add a little bit of science and a whole lot of MacGyvering or ingenuity. So here are some examples of technologies that are emerging today that we really should be looking at as we go towards these increasingly distant locales. We need to keep up our skills, we need to practice, and virtual reality is becoming an increasingly emerging technology that we can leverage for keeping up those skills. It essentially is like an emerging version of the Matrix. And in fact, one of my day jobs with Luxonic Technologies is to develop immersive medical care for deep space missions. AI, or artificial intelligence and deep learning, are other examples of technologies that can help us with decision making, with pattern recognition, as well as learning on deep space missions. In addition, we need to pay attention to the power of gene synthesis and powers such as CRISPR, point of care diagnostics with blood sampling, portable imaging, and more. The other challenge is we're going to have to be able to take all of these things, AI, like HAL 9000 but friendlier. We're going to have to take virtual reality, all of these point of care blood analyzers, diagnostics, and bring them back to the Aladdin principle, itty bitty living space. But this is just the beginning. There are so many challenges out there when we talk about the future of space medicine. And I want to just end with some of my thoughts of the challenges that remain to be solved once we've solved every single one of those tick boxes on the NASA Human Research Roadmap. So one question that we have yet to solve is, what exactly is the gravity prescription? This was phrased as such by one of the former chief medical officers of Johnson Space Center, Dr. Jim Logan, and he basically made the point that we don't know what amount of gravity, at what frequency, for what duration we need to keep ourselves, our bones, our bodies, our immune systems, our fluid shifts, our central nervous systems happy. We have 2 extreme and opposite examples. We have every single human being here on Earth who's been exposed to 1G, and we have astronauts on the ISS who've been living in microgravity. But what is the bare minimum? Is it 17% gravity that we would experience on the moon? If that's the case, that's perfect, because then by the time we go to Mars, we know exactly that we have the knowledge that even half of what we experience on the moon is more than enough for Mars. If it's not, well, then we still have several surprises to solve and figure out by the time we get to Mars. The nature of work that we plan to do as we go to these distant locales will also change. On the ISS, in constant weightlessness, our spacewalks consist of repairs of telescopes, repairs of the Canadarm, repairs of the International Space Station in microgravity. As we look forward to the Moon and Mars, we will be establishing permanent surface operations. We'll be conducting EVAs or extravehicular activities for science, for exploration, for mining, and more. That means, statistically speaking, something bad is going to happen on at least one of those EVAs, whether it's a trauma, whether it's an allergic reaction, whether it's severe pain, whether it's a cardiac arrest. That means we need to start thinking about our medical capabilities for EVA today. Back to the radiation problem. We've talked a little bit about how much radiation that we're going to be exposed to once we're beyond the confines of the Van Allen belt. But we don't know exactly yet what the solution is to how much radiation protection we need in our habitats. Is there a habitat with enough, with the material or thickness of material that can prevent ionizing radiation from harming us? Is our only solution to live below ground in the thickened regolith? That's a solution that we're going to have to solve or figure out pretty quickly once we get to the Moon and Mars. Here's something I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is what is the logical progression in which we will go about establishing permanent medical capabilities off-world? So we talked a little bit about what medical capabilities are on the International Space Station. So you have a crew medical officer, 40 hours of training, you have basic all medical supplies, life-saving supplies, basic life support kit, and an advanced life support kit. If you need to evacuate, you can evacuate 3.5 hours away. When you're on the Moon and Mars, you have to have a less evacuation contingent medical care plan. So that comes to going forward in a stepwise fashion and building up those capabilities, especially if we plan on living on the Moon permanently and operating there permanently, and same with Mars. So here's how I envision that going about. Similar to the ISS, starting with a crew medical officer with first aid training, basic medical kits, and then building a capability for advanced life support as well as medical capabilities for EVAs, building in basic surgical capabilities as well as a field hospital, and then advancing to advanced surgical capabilities, and finally building in that final bottom layer of a pyramid, including primary care, screening maneuvers that will allow us to conduct more advanced procedures like endoscopy, colonoscopies, laparoscopy. So will we be able to surpass our standard of care on Mars? And knowing how literally alien these environments are, will this give rise and breed brand new genres of doctors? Will we be training medical specialists in moon medicine or Martian medicine? What will that curriculum look like, and how will that training happen? What will the board exam for a Mars surgeon look like? And as we come full circle, I have to ask this question. Infectious disease, as we know in 2020, is no joke, and neither are pandemics. So it's only a matter of time that we're going before we encounter the first moondemic. Will we be prepared when that happens? And if so, what will social distancing guidelines look like for coronavirus on the Moon? In 1/6 gravity, will particles of COVID fly further, and will we have to distance ourselves to 36 feet? The time to start thinking about these issues is now. And while we're thinking about far-fetched, far-off ideas, if the idea is to truly become a permanent, multi-world faring species, well, to do that, we need to be able to procreate and become a multi-generational species. And this is a whole talk unto itself. But what does it take to not just deliver on Mars, but to properly conceive, gestate, deliver, and develop a brand new life, the human on Mars? Not to mention the ethics of delving into that unknown. And one of my favorite questions, once we've survived on the moon, once we've thrived on Mars, where do we go to next? And as we go to that next destination and keep this idea of healthcare in mind, because where humans go, healthcare and principles of medicine and surviving and thriving must follow. How do we manage those standards of care? How do we standardize and govern those principles of best practices in medicine? Do we have to establish a galactic health organization? And how will that be governed? The good news is none of these problems are going away anytime soon. And that means we need you to come bring your brains and your passions to space medicine. Because at the end of the day, there is space for all of us, and space needs all of us. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Shawna Pandya, and I hope that you've had some food for thought when it comes to the future of space medicine and the questions that we have yet to solve.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mike MONGO pow. Greetings and salutations from beautiful downtown Sherman Oaks, Los Angeles, California, where I am the host of Mike MONGO's Astronaut Adventures, the author of Mike MONGO's Astronaut Instruction Manual for Preteens, and making a television series about the first kids in space right now here in Los Angeles. And I am very happy to be addressing the members and supporters of the National Space Society and people who I would ordinarily see at the International Space Development Conference, which sadly this year was canceled because of the quarantine. So the reason I even have the YouTube studio that I've created is because of the quarantine. I turned quarantine into a space mission training for young students. And so for the past almost 15 years, I've been encouraging young students how I use my abilities to grab people's attention and to inspire people to pursue their dreams and their passions for space, is that I reach out to students, I connect with students, and I empower them to imagine themselves living, working, and playing in space. The NSS has supported that mission for years now. I've been a member since 2013. The first time I spoke, I think it was 2014. At 2015 is when Bruce Pittman said, had a talk and inspired me with these words that when they at NASA found challenges that they wanted students to put an eye to, they would present the challenges to students without telling them that it was difficult, like asteroid mining, for instance. And the students would go and solve the problems without knowing that it was difficult and come back with answers that were remarkable. And that's the exact same thing I do when I encourage students to pursue careers in space and astronautics, is that I don't tell them how difficult it is to be an astronaut or a space professional or a grown-up for that matter. I give them tools to handle it every day, one day at a time, until they get to the place they want to go to. And the place they want to go to is space. And the reason that I encourage them to go to space is because I believe, after working for 15 years as a space science professional, that as an astronaut teacher, that we can solve all the challenges we face on Earth by solving for space. We can solve for health, we can solve for energy, we can solve for inclusion, we can solve for equity, we can solve for the illusion of scarcity by solving for space. And I don't know anything better than that. And I want to say thank you to the NSS, to the board of governors, to the board of advisors, to the chairs, to everybody involved, for all the work that everybody commits to this dream of humanity getting to space. Like author Frank White says, we go to space and we look at the Earth in a different way. We get what he calls the overview effect. We as space people know this and love this. And I'm grateful for the opportunity that the NSS provides through the ISDC to reach out to people all over the world, and today, a day in space, so that we can imagine a future that works out for all of us. My name is Mike MONGO. Keep up the good work, and I'll see you at ISDC 2021. In the words of my people, pow, pow, pow.